Welcome to you all. My name is Jeremy Salmon, and this is The Butcher, the Baker, and the Candlestick Maker, where we have a fantastic panel of leading thinkers, protagonists, and guardians of the public realm here to discuss retail. What does the future hold for retail in our towns and cities? To my immediate left, I'm delighted to introduce Julie Pears, real estate developer and placemaker. In Julie's own words, town centre regeneration has been the cornerstone of her career, from early agency and fund advisory through to leading development roles within Into, and now a pivotal role as head of future places, lovely title, and head of development for Ellandi, one of the leading and reasonably recent new forces to emerge in the community-focused development. And if you go to Ellandi's website, you'll see they say things like 40 communities since 2008. And what's nice about that is actually they're using the word communities and not the pejorative of projects or developments, which is a specific thing we'll come to talk through, including the revisioning of Folkestone Town Centre in the UK, an award-winning £50 million mixed-use development in the heart of Brighton, which I have a particular affinity to. And two new management appointments for Into Merry Hill, a large destination near Birmingham, and into Milton Keynes, both actually significant retail destinations fundamental to their local towns and communities. Julie, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
To Julie's left, my pleasure to introduce Patrick Dubeck. Patrick is head of Regeneration at the Greater London Authority, or GLA. For those that you don't know, that top-tier administration body for Greater London, in support of the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Patrick's career is born out of public service and governance of regeneration. He joined the GLA in 2014, rapidly moving through a number of key roles to his current position, now leading a variety of civic infrastructure programs, working with partners. Collaboration, I think, is being a big point of that. To maximise the social, economic, cultural and positive environmental impact of place-focused investment. Suffice to say, Patrick is a massive fan of all things London, but also through the intricacies of scale, from concerns and nurturing of the high street at a granular level through to big city issues such as global tourism, national infrastructure and so forth. I think we've all been very busy over the last 9-10 months, but I imagine Patrick and his team have been particularly busy over that period. So delighted you can join us today.
Thank you, delighted to be here.
And to Patrick's left, again, my very great pleasure to introduce Paul Hanegraaf. Paul trained as an architect, and then subsequently at the London School of Business as a Sloan Fellow. Paul's career has seen him hold senior architectural and design leadership roles, creating and leading studios in the UK and Europe, to director advisory roles to real estate investment funds, to directoring a modular leisure dwelling fabrication company, I understand.
The startup that didn't work.
Yep, superb. And his long-standing role as creative navigator, again, another fantastic title for Milligan Retail, a leading mixed-use development company in the UK and Europe, with such signature projects as the Mailbox in the centre of Birmingham, Zubayati, again in the centre of Bilbao, and the Camden Lock Market in London, where the three pulled out. His most recent endeavour, Creative Trades, the aggregation of makers and craftsperson into a community in itself, and as a destination for others, talks to his continual search to remedy the prosaic, the lazy, and the cookie-cutter activation of place. Paul is both creative and entrepreneur, and driven, as are all three of our panellists, by an underlying passion to create real value for people through place. Thank you all for coming today. That's plenty of me talking. I wanted to open the conversation really. I mean, the big issue, of course, at the time is COVID and COVID recovery. It's on everyone's mind. But I thought if we could just perhaps one at a time just go through and give a snapshot of where, in terms of retail, where were we 9 months ago? And perhaps what fundamentally has changed in that period? Julie, if I can start with you.
Yeah, by all means. Well, I think it's true to say that 3 years ago, we were already identifying that there was an over-reliance on retail within our towns and cities. And so the sort of reinvention and the repurposing of towns and of shopping centres had started to happen. But of course, what we've seen over the last few months is that pace of change has accelerated even more. And so there is a call to arms for all of the stakeholders within a town centre, within a city centre, to really understand what the purpose of those towns and cities truly is going forward. So, I'm sure we'll come on to this about public-private partnerships, but it's absolutely fundamental that all key stakeholders are aligned in an overarching vision for a town. And core to that is understanding the purpose and what the demographics are around that town in particular.
Is that a new cohesion emergent now, or do you feel that was something that was happening? Certainly within the context, we're very much sitting in the UK, we're talking about a UK frame of context really, but trying to talk about the global influence. Was that cohesion something you'd perceived before in terms of the needs, or is it something now accelerated?
Definitely, we recognised it before. We worked at Ellandi, we worked with CACI 2.5 years ago now to identify just how much over-reliance on retail there is. And we identified that 49% of our shopping centres just had too much space. So, we were all thinking about it at that time. But as I said, the pace of change has just accelerated. And now we're looking at how we reinvent some of those towns. I think in terms of the cities, maybe the impetus wasn't quite there because actually it was held up by the workers. But now cities are coming into the fray and we're having to start to think about what is the future of cities. My arena generally is towns, but certainly with the cities.
Exactly, the broader, that scale issue is something we'll touch upon. Patrick, in terms of where were you and what was your retail concerns in terms of city scale activation 9 months ago, and what's changed?
There were certainly concerns there. There was a recognition that there was a sort of fundamental economic restructuring that was already emerging. But clearly all of that's been accelerated. I mean, it's become a sort of a well-acknowledged fact that what we're seeing happening in the retail economy, but also more broadly in our sort of town centre and urban economies, is an acceleration of 10, 15 years worth of travel happening very, very quickly. I mean, all of my work is focused on London, clearly. And to sort of pick up on Julie's point, I think it's true that the character of London as a place is sort of the real global city of the UK and hyperdensity that it entails means that some of those factors are having a different bearing on different bits of London. But we know very, very clearly that the sorts of places that are being affected really, really, really dramatically are the most dense bits of our cities and our towns. We've done lots and lots of work on this, just analysing data over the past few months, and we know that your out of town, more suburban retail outlets have sort of returned to trend a little bit more quickly. The town centre, what we call in a London sense, a sort of metropolitan town centre scale, have fared slightly worse, but then the international centres have fared worse just because there is no tourism at the minute. So all of these restructuring impacts are being brought to bear very, very quickly. I think they're affecting different bits of our urban places differently, and the impacts and the sort of strategies that these places are going to need are quite different. And I think it's really hard to conceive of what they might be right now. We're living in a world where things change incredibly quickly, and the lie of the land is sort of shifting underneath our feet. And this applies globally, I know.
Again, it's a topic I think we'll come back to a little bit later in terms of sort of how you start to break cities down in a granular way. And it seems to me a lot of the things we're looking at are solutions much at the granular level that sequentially add up and come together. Paul, if I can come to you, 9 months ago, sir.
It's a bit easier now because it's hindsight, but I think 9 months ago, a year ago, we were looking tactically. We were all looking tactically. We could sense a move, we could sense a shift. Was it bigger marketing spend? Was it free parking? Was it And what we missed was the strategic shift, which is behavior. This situation that we're in has allowed the human being, the populace, to modify, to change, to transform their behavior. And that behavior change, those behavior changes will have over the longer periods of time, fundamental impact on the consumerism at large. And for me, one of the things I found the most remarkable is the concept of trust went away. I mean, the whole issue of trust. Who do I trust? What can I trust? How can I trust it? And that aligns with values. What are my value systems? What are my values? What's important to me now? What's so much more important to me now that wasn't important to me before? And how do I shift that? And so watching that whole consumer behavior change and those transformations, you can see it across the piece. And I don't think we understood that wave was coming. Because again, we were looking tactically. We're property people. We're average rainwater people. Yeah. Although we do research analysis, we tend to do it in the historic way. You know, Dan Parr's CACI, it's isometric, it's socioeconomic. And so 9 months ago, I was talking to social anthropologists, and I was talking to behavioralists, because we had a sense of what, but we didn't know. Yeah. And that's a big, and that change is upon us. And what I find really interesting now is, and Julie and I were talking just before we came on, we were measuring one of our big competitors' performance in their portfolios. And it's all based on, it's 80% of what it used to be. Whereas what it used to be is what we're trying for, as opposed to it's moved 30% or 20% in the new way. Yep. And what's the new way, and how can we embrace that new way and maybe make that 50% of the new way rather than 20% of the old way? That mindset shift, because our business is, it's the HMS, it's an immovable beast, is yet to learn, but there's a lot to go.
It's very interesting. I think if you like, the series of headings I've tried to structure kind of try to break down the relevance of retail to the future, to cities and the activation of city spaces. And the first one actually touches up what you were talking to about a perspective on the customer, really. So I wanted to talk first about sort of generational shifts in expectation, which is to say, I come from a retail background. I'm well versed in the fact that brands per se they'll take a description of who they think their customer is. It's a pejorative thing, but they'll be trying to define their customer. You talk about the urban context. A certain component, say someone of my generation, would carry a certain nostalgia. So you almost have people with nostalgia. And then there seems to be generations who have less or none of the nostalgia for place. And you can transport that to an affinity with how the high street works. The department stores either end and put a name to it. Could be a Debenhams as part of the community. And that, but even though you interrogate people and you say, yes, it's part of my life, but you find they haven't been there in the last 6, 7, 8 months and bought anything. In terms of the younger generations, they have new allegiances, one might say. So my question really is, what place, within the context of retail, what place nostalgia in creating place? And how is that helpful in creating, I think, an essential sense of belonging in terms of urban places?
It's interesting you talked about the department stores then, and you mentioned Debenhams, and of course there's House of Fraser. But of course a lot of those weren't Debenhams and House of Fraser 20, 30 years ago. They all had individual local names. They were individual department stores. Yeah. And, my mother still talks about Starling Gerrish, who nobody would have heard of, but it's a department store in Salisbury. It never became, in her eyes, it never became House of Fraser. So I think that's nostalgia in terms of retail is where somebody would often go. But I do firmly believe that we can start to ensure that we make new connections. And it doesn't all have to be predicated on the retailers we've got it now. Yes. And it can be reinvented. And during the COVID pandemic, of course, we've started to look at how we sort of bring the markets back in and create something just a little bit unique, special. Paul was telling me about the fact that he'd been to Columbia Markets at the weekend. Well, I live very close to Chiswick, and they've started a flower market there, and the buzz that had was amazing. And people will remember that because it's a very, very special excursion. So you talk about nostalgia, but actually I think it's about making new nostalgia, new connections, and not necessarily relying on the old.
Yeah, I think very much so. Yeah, Patrick, what do you?
I would sort of slightly disagree with the sort of the framing, in a sense that I think a younger generation do have an attachment to place. The nostalgia for sort of retail and the sort of the main attractor to place has changed. But I still think people who live in towns, in cities, know where their nearest town centre is. It might not be synonymous with their big department store anymore, but it's synonymous with the sort of the density of activity that happens, and there might be a different form of a attractor to that place in the future. I think retail's portion of that is going to change and shift. I still think that in the future we're going to be looking at bigger interest needing to take the sort of the overarching risk and curating that mix that happens in much the same way as department stores with concessions originally conceived. I just think the types of risk, the types of occupations in those spaces are going to be changing and shifting quite a bit. And the sort of the function of those places is going to have to be more flexible, far more flexible for the next few years than it has been over the past.
Yes, well, I'm glad to say you've eroded the fundamental leading part of my question, is that the young have a nostalgia for places, or some reason resonance with place. I mean, my answer to what was I doing 9 months ago, it was probably trying to think about ways of creating FOMO, fear of missing out, to bring them in and engage the physical place with the Instagram moment as that strategy. It's probably these sort of things still have a resonance in today. Paul, your thoughts on?
Should we say maybe a bit of a contrarian. It's because, except for this fine young gentleman, most of us are viewers. And nostalgia speaks of a longing and legacy of the past. It's what I used to know. When can I bring it back? And yet, I think the consuming public are more engaged in an authenticity or an integrity, and having an authorship in. And it's more about cults and cliques and group behavior and group dynamic than I think it is trying to make it what it was. So again, if you go back to behavior, what's really fascinating is you look at all these communities that are shutting streets on weekends just to ostensibly to let the commerce trade better.
Yes, yeah.
What that's simply done is energized the populace to commune.
Yep.
I will say 3-4 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, Northcote Road in Clapham. I mean, they shut the whole thing down, 1.5 miles. They shut it down. Sunny day, an astonishing festival of life. And that's. I'm not saying that's nostalgic. I mean, is that nostalgic? I think it's a new energy. It's a convening energy. It's a community energy. It's a definition of my place and my time and my spirit. And as people, the 20-year-olds that live up on the hill came down, and now they're proud of their hood. And so I think the nostalgia is cool for those of us that knew of Hernan's department store. But right now, it's about my experience, my place, and my time in my own.
There's a re-emergence. There's a continuation of a sense of investment in place, but it's through a sense of authenticity and almost you call it a democratization of space and people taking possession of in their own sense.
Yeah. There's another fantastic example, actually. You talked about Northcote Road, but in Cardiff, they shut off the area around the castle, and they put out tables and chairs with QR codes, and you basically sit down, and then you order from wherever in the city your food, and your food comes to the table. Isn't that amazing? That's so that's tactical urbanism along with technology, and that's what's going to be creating those special moments.
Which brings me very nicely to the topic of technology, and the fact that communities invariably are built through a a cohesive set of shared values, which creates the sort of an identity, a cohesive identity. In the world of retail, the brands were very quick to kind of, in this divergence of the physical and the online, to kind of understand they needed to curate both channels and create what they would call these omni-channel up. So in many ways, they were embracing all the ways to talk to their customers. It felt, in my world, as working ostensibly for shopping destinations, shopping centres, the shopping centres were a little bit slower to appreciate that and absorb that. So my question is, in terms of this overlying technology in place coming together in an overall cohesive experience, what is the opportunity then for high streets, cities and town centres to do a similar manoeuvre and bring these two domains together in a way to create that overlay, that sense of authenticity in a new sense? What do you think, Julie, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, you know, we mustn't forget that there is a section of the population who do not use social media. And so, you know, my challenge to anyone creating place is how you create an inclusive place. Now, it's not really answering your question, but it's a bit of I get on that bandwagon all the time because I live in a community and in our street, there's probably 20% that don't use technology. And so I just think we've got to be really careful about how we do that so that we don't ostracize people that aren't able to do that, or just feel that they can't, or have anxiety when they use technology. There's a neighbour of mine who she just becomes extremely anxious because she's not confident with it. So
yeah, it's very well. I mean,
sorry, it didn't answer your question.
Well, no, but certainly
I think
it
it's
does
very important.
Talk to this. If there is a move to the inevitably progress dictates that things happen. There is, I suspect, in urban environments, a overlayering of technology which becomes part of our experience of the world. But it's key to its success that it can't be the only way to give access to that world in a sense as you move forward. What are your thoughts, Patrick, in terms of the...
I agree with Julie, there's still a ways to go in terms of digital adoption. I mean, coming at this from a slightly different end of the spectrum, we do a lot of work with markets, street markets, covered markets in and around London. There's a long, long way to go for those sort of bits of nascent enterprise in terms of digital enterprise, simple stuff like card payments. And in London, we do a lot of investment in that sort of infrastructure, that sort of digital adoption type support to get some of that nascent enterprise, which is really important to creating place. You know, we're talking about some of the sort of really locally rooted functions, you know, commercially minded entrepreneurs, that sort of nascent entrepreneurial sense that is, you know, alive and well in many of our places, needs support, but there's a long way to go in terms of digital adoption there. At the other end of the spectrum, you know, the big brands, I completely agree. They've been a long, long way down this road in moving towards omni-channels and thinking about how they use digital technology instead of bricks and mortar. But I still think those brands rely on a critical mixing of population, a criticality of activity to create a buzz, to create a sense of what their brand's all about. And you know, digital channels can help to a degree, but these brands are going to recognize at some point that it might not be about selling volumes through bricks and mortar retail, but there's going to be a really important function of place and convening people to sort of socialize around their vision of what their sort of commerce is all about.
And I think the obvious thing to say that within the world of a brand, it's much clearer who is the sort of the governance and the stewardship of the place or the brand is. Actually, as soon as you start to go into the public realm, it is democratized and in this, it's more fractured in terms of who is curating. But in a way, perhaps the question is, do you see an emergence of a role? We'll come later to the sort of public-private dynamic, emergence of new roles to manage and curate public realm in that sense, maybe. Paul, your thoughts on that?
Oh, again, I think it's if we look at it as what is technology doing to the nostalgia of retail of old, I think we're again missing a bit of a trick. There's a couple of things to that. I think I totally support and agree with what Julie shared and what's being picked up there is that it is not across spectrum. And there's a lot of people. Look at what happened with homeschooling. I mean, the tragedy of the lack of technology and the loss of retained learning in 3 months, 12 years. I mean, it's tragic. It's just tragic, and it shouldn't be. And so I think understanding that and working with that and knowing that, I think, is really, really important. However, what the technology does is it gives us some things that are really important and that the high street can do. Learning. Find ways to learn through it, with it, alongside it. Let it fulfill me. Let it inform me. Let it take me to places I haven't been before. Raw knowledge. The conversation of why should I be buying this? What is it I'm buying? How much of it is I'm buying? Why am I buying it? I want to touch it. Where can I go touch it? The integration, and you're starting to see it at the biggest end of the marketplace. You know, when Amazon is going to come in and buy like the Into portfolio and take their business to the streets as a whole bit of technology. But in terms of placemaking, and I'm racking my brain to try to remember what it was, but I researched an organization it started in Israel, in Tel Aviv, and it was they're app developers, and there was a street about 2 districts away from the heart of the beach in Tel Aviv that was trying to get connected to the tourism business of the heart of Tel Aviv on the coast. So the city said, okay, we'll put a tram line in. So that when they're putting the tram line in, it basically bifurcated the 2 sides of the street. And so retail and everything started to die. Well, these guys created a neighborhood app for that. They created a neighborhood currency that was only available within a certain range of telephone masts and stacks. So they used technology to bring the community together, to create a conversation, to create ownership that then saved that street and saved that place. And they're now in New York and they're in London, and that technological advocacy for the sense of community was really, really positive. And it's a really clever trick.
It is in a sense. My next topic really is to talk about the emergence of localism, which kind of I've got down here, the guilty pleasures of localism, in the sense that, you know, on the face of it, I find elements of it disturbing in it could, for example, represent the death of cities, the thing that we've invested in over the last X hundred years, and unraveling 100 years of thinking about dense is good, proximity is good, and it manifests a certain sense of a cosmopolitan thing that allows us to become somewhat more bigger than we are, surprises ourselves. But my question about the localism piece is about scale, and it comes back to the clever piece perhaps in what you're talking about, the ability to create something relevant at a local scale, but in itself inherently scalable to make localism relevant.
What better place than London, or the likes of London, to discover that? Because it's a vast set of 200 some communities, 200 villages. So those villages are now finding themselves in a very unique way, more centric and more important to the occupants' lives. We're doing a bit of our own homework now, and it came out of us looking at working from home, and our little bit of research called the deregulation of life. Okay, so it's people's lives through this pandemic are being allowed to change. The rule of order, rule of law has fallen away. I don't have to be at the office at 9 a.m. And I don't have to wear a blue suit, and I don't have to wear a white starched shirt, and I don't have to. And the technology allows me to broaden my day. I mean, it's some of the research we're working with, it shows, for instance, lines of when people took lunch and dinner in 1974 and where it happens now, and graphs of who worked on weekends and how they worked on weekends then as opposed to now. And as you can imagine, right now it's basically flat because everything happens all of the time. What that means is that I don't have to be there at that time at that same place. And so that whole concept of taking those rules of law and order out of my social behavior and out of my life's pattern, it leads to the localism. It supports the localism. In fact, working from home is driving that more than anything else. It's a real fascinating phenomenon.
Again, my perspective, again, you made the point about sort of London or big cities being aggregations of villages, which I think is fantastic, because you could almost think that kind of if people are leaving the city, invariably it would be the worker flow, people that would migrant sort of flow of the workers, but also those that leave the urban environment tend to be ones that are economically empowered to do so, to move to the countryside. And there's an underlying pejorative that then what's that left behind, and sort of devaluing or putting in jeopardy the kind of the value of the city. So I kind of came to the conclusion, and this is the question really for Patrick, in the sense of the big city stuff, is yes, you can see the functionality of the village within the context of the city, but what about those big overriding big city issues? You mentioned tourism, or the place of that version of retail, if you like, within it. How do you see that moving?
Not without challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about sort of localism, and there's lots of sort of slightly rose-tinted, I think, observations of how it could be really, really beneficial to communities, to neighbourhoods, to people. For me, I always come back to mix and use. So mix of uses, but a density of uses as well. That's what makes places successful.
And density is good still.
Well, density has to be good, because density is what creates nodes for employment, for opportunity. It's what creates places around people, that which people coalesce. It's not just about work. It's about people meeting one another. And there's huge implications for what COVID creates for all of that. But density, mix are really important. I think there's lots and lots of positive outcomes for our villages in London. I mean, we talk about 200 places. In my world, we always talk about 600 high streets in London. So just to trump the 200, I'll go 600. 600 high streets, and we don't have the boulevards of Paris. We don't have the sort of the piazzas of Southern Europe. But what we do have are these sort of arterial high streets where in some places they are rugged. They are the sorts of places that you probably only see if you drive through in a car. Some of them, but they're incredibly important. They employ masses and masses of people, and they are the places that I think we need to start thinking about a lot more clearly. Not all places are equal, and I think that sort of inequality in density and mix will be a real problem if we don't think about how it's addressed, because having a sort of more geographically disparate model of development in a city, yes, brings opportunity, but also brings great challenge, because that opportunity that we often see sort of coalesce in the center of cities is not going to happen organically, sort of spread across all of these different nodes in a city. So it's going to require a level of intervention, because the default will be that we'll see entrenched inequality in our places. It does beg a question about the centres, because that's where you rely on this sort of hyper density.
Absolutely.
I've been reading lots and lots and lots about this, and I'll be honest, I don't think anyone has the answers right now. The big problem for our global cities is that for the last 20, 30 years longer, I mean, London in particular, in the last 10 years, we've seen a huge success in the development of new office space, commercial space, masses and masses of it in London. All of it high-rise, all of it relying on lifts. Lifts and public transit are now a huge problem for cities everywhere. And I think the future is going to require some very, very nimble thinking about those things, but it's going to require us to think about how we use time far more effectively, and how when people are making their trips into our urban centres, there is a compression of activity. You're going to be doing meetings, you're going to be having the sort of engagements, the sort of deep work, as I often refer to it now. You're going to have to be doing that in a compressed bit of time, and you're going to have to be thinking about how, from the way we manage all of the other important bits of our cities, the wider economic function, the wider cultural and social function, we're going to have to compress all of that activity and make sure it's captured, because people are going to be coming to cities probably less often.
I think it's the key, isn't it? In terms of actually the specifics of the workplace environment, you could see the quantum of office space. People need more space, but they'll be coming less frequently. So you don't see a net. There's an issue of valuation, perhaps, of that to a degree, but actually the use of the workplace environment can sort of balance out. It's the peripheral economies that drive revenue or are subsistent to that. You can see from a retail perspective needing to change quite quickly. So I think we talked the other day, and you talked about the pret-a-manger economy, which was a wonderful phrase I picked up, and because I empathise in resisting spending that much money myself on a sandwich.
My spending patterns have come full circle. I try now, when I come into the city, I try now and spend a penny in pret-a-manger.
Do you think there's a disproportionate rebalancing?
That sort of business model is under real pressure, but it's not. It causes time for reflection, and it does cause concern. Lots of that sort of spend is going to come under real pressure. The pret-a-manger stuff has been in sort of political discourse over the last few months, and I think we need to recognise that those sorts of business models, all of that sort of SME activity that clusters around dense commercial activity. We might, classify it as retail. I think retail sometimes lacks definition in the way that you use it.
Yeah.
All of that is going to have to become far more dispersed. It simply has to. And those business models are going to have to change very, very quickly.
When we're talking about the villages as well, perhaps this is the time to just touch on the green economy.
Yes.
Because, of course, if you're talking about localism, you're talking about, the 15-minute town or the 20-minute neighbourhood. There's lots and lots of expressions, but they all mean the same thing, is actually people using sustainable modes of transport to get around. Having things locally is going to help that green agenda. So that's a very, very positive thing to have come out of this.
Yeah, I was going to move on to talk about new uses under the guise of the fact from a retail perspective, we've seen a move from focus on product, producing products. We've had conversations about peak stuff. We've moved from product to a focus more on experience in the retail world. And I suppose in a way, you're sort of now, the question is beyond experience, where are we now moving to? It has to be a little bit more than just safety, I think, in terms of that context. But I was picking up on the sort of consumer awareness generally is moving to sustainability and a desire for eco-friendly choices in how they create their version of authenticity, what is real, and somehow resonance with them. I don't know how you see the kind of the solutions for the city kind of economies coming through, again, a realignment and a change in what different values are and how value is reconfigured in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. One of the, I'm going to give a little bit of a plug here, and for viewers or people who are tuning in who aren't from the UK, it might be worth a look. We published something at City Hall called Adaptive Strategies for Town Centres and High Streets. It was published in January, pre-COVID. But I was looking back at it in preparing for coming to speak here today, and found that lots and lots of what's there, I think, is still really, really of merit, values consideration. Every place is going to need a strategy for how they adapt, for how they think about the challenges that they face. Sustainability is a key challenge. I think some of the 15-minute city debate, again, huge sort of positivity in terms of how it can adjust the way that we use our city centres, how we use our spaces. But as I say, I think challenges, we need to think about density mix, but think about how inherently there is flexibility built into the way that we think about our places. We can't have, it's going to be very, very difficult to think about sort of single asset portfolios as an investor in the future.
No, absolutely.
It's going to be very, very difficult to not think about at the point of sort of investment, at the point of commitment, the sort of the horizon, and how flexibility is sort of built into that thinking around use in a way that perhaps the sort of model of town centre development, certainly in Britain over the last few years, has not had to consider in the same way.
So I think we're going to see is more of our companies, more of councils, more of becoming operating entities. You can see it in how the local authorities have closed streets and become real strong hand in making that place operate differently. Our big value giver historically has been and will remain for many ways the value in the bricks and mortar. And we did a lease and we didn't give 3 bananas of what's going on. That's got to change. The building is going to become a marketing expense. And the real value is going to become in that driving experience, and whatever it is, whether it's a purchase, whether it's a dining, whether it's a learning, it's going to be it has to be in that way and in that culture. And then the 15-minute city, or the analysis of the study that I just recently read about super blocks in Barcelona. It really helps when it's a massively gridded city, but they're taking 9 blocks, 3 square, and then cutting traffic within that down to reducing it. And then in each of those little communities, they're inserting community uses, medical uses, civic uses, and these communities are getting stronger and better. But it's an operating business. It's creating a way of behavior and a way of knowing and learning and engagement that has nothing to do with real estate. And I think that's where our worlds are really going to have to start stepping forward.
You've come nicely to my next question, which was more pointed actually to Paul and Julie, given what I know you do. If you can actually sort of perhaps share with us a little bit, because I know you're both looking after assets and managing assets at the moment, and come to the topic of new uses. Let us know some secrets, if you can, about how are you kind of re-energizing and bringing new uses, and what are those uses that you're finding work in specific places?
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, what Paul said there sort of relates to how we started this conversation, and that over-reliance on retail. How do you bring new uses in? And it's about bringing, go back to the stakeholders together. You've mentioned the councils. The councils are absolutely pivotal in all of this, and how we reimagine our town centres. I mean, I have this one fantastic example, which I get giddy with excitement about because I really hope it comes off, is we're looking at a further education college currently in a suburban location within a coastal town, and they're interested in coming into the town centre and into, dare I say, repurposing the shopping centre. Now, this is all, we're exploring things at the moment, but the beauty of that is that actually, if you've got student population coming in, they're coming in and out at different times. It's not like another education, like a school, where it's drop off and pick up.
Yeah.
So you've really got to think about how you bring in uses that are going to sustain the current or the residual retail that's there. And civic uses, libraries, that's another example. But all of these civic uses were pushed out to the suburbs in the 80s and 90s when retail was king and the most value. And now we're seeing them all starting to come back in for the benefit of the local community. And, of course, they're much more sustainable locations.
Interesting. I mean, I think I'm just a small point there. My perspective, having sort of lived and worked around the world, it seems to be the UK was a little bit unusual in its protection of retail over the last sort of 10 to 15, 20 years, perhaps, and actually only recently started to open up in terms of its shift toward or away from always securing the retail kind of use within a town context. I wanted to come through to, I don't know, Paul, perhaps on the new uses. I wasn't going to let you off the hook there.
I'm fascinated by what you just said, because we've got one of those as well. And it kind of showed up on our doorstep, and we thought, well, that's really pretty cool, because it's there, but it's a wholesale move into the town center, and it just gives it life. It's amazing, because so often the first rule of response is, well, we'll do residential, we'll do build to rent, or we'll do PRS, or it's like stop. Okay, would you just stop?
Bring population equals footfall.
And I think there's all sorts of things. I mean, there's the transformation of the way in which we as real estate people make money out of space. So that whole contract that we have with that occupier, if it goes from a landlord and a bill collector or a rent collector to an operator, so you're worried about their business, you're partnering with them, you're allowing them to come in and grow and making them grow. In my creative trade work, in 2019, there were over 4.5 million new businesses started at Companies House in 10 years, between 2008, last deep recession, and 19. That you take that down to 75% of them fail. That leftover number per day is astonishing, and all they need is an opportunity. All they need is a shoulder to kind of push them along and help them grow. And what's really fascinating is again, in London, in East London, Hackney Wick, those warehouses full of innovators always get pushed out. We move them on. Sorry, value's gone up. That has to transform. One of the most heartening things I read this week, and I've come to know, I know Cockpit Arts very, very well. I know Annie Warburton well when she was at the Crafts Council. They've got this program where they recruit 16 to 24-year-old individuals with an aptitude for making and whatever they're doing. 2 years of basically free space. David builds the businesses out of them. They're seeding their own future by giving to those that need. We have to seed our own future by giving to those that need. On the high streets and the main streets, it's the councils doing it, it's us doing it. If we seed our own future, then we'll find fortune.
It's clear. I mean, I hope I did justice to the description earlier in the introduction of creative trades, but in essence, the idea of the created maker culture. What interested me about it, what I took from it wasn't per se the act of making and selling a good or bespoke article. Is the almost that sort of, we would call it a blurring a definition, where actually it would be more, in a way, the real con would be the fact that kind of people would want to come and learn, and in a sort of soft education process, understand how to become makers themselves. So that blurring of those new uses coming together seems to be a really interesting force.
It's really interesting because it weaves a passion of connoisseurism.
Mm.
You know, I ride bicycles. I pay more money for my bicycles than my wife ever wants me to, and I'm fine. You know, and others will do a fishing rod or golf clubs, and it's about a life's experience and a life's passion. That is there. So there's a learning for it and a learning of it, a love of learning. There's group learning. I mean, the online learning and the traditional one-to-one or group learning is just massive. And it's also about growing businesses. It's our attempt, and we're finding places to launch it now, because in this environment, it's a rich concept. Helping businesses to grow, and it's really, we have all the skill sets from our previous retail world. If we just drop the mechanisms, adopt new mechanisms, and they will grow.
We're under time pressure to close in the next few minutes. My last topic, really, I think perhaps there's a closing comment, if I can ask all you to think about, was the new forms of leadership. We talk about communities, stakeholder engagement, we talk about public-private collaboration. How do you see new forms of leadership manifesting within the context of our cities and town centres? Perhaps Paul, we can start with you.
Oh, wow. We have to listen more. We have to be willing to learn. We have to be willing to drop the old behaviors and adopt new behaviors and new understandings. We always say, certainly in our retail world, we always do this consumer research and stuff. I think we have to listen more. And then it's collective leadership. You were saying the councils. I mean, coming alongside the councils, there's a mind trust of knowledge there, and you come alongside them and partner. It's collaboration. It's redefining what success looks like. Change the metric of success. You know, you'll eventually make money as a real estate person, but if I focus not on the finance and I focus on the human being and the behavior and the engagement with them, I think that will lead me to a financial end game.
Fantastic. Patrick?
I agree. I think we're going to have to find ways of investing in local capacity to sort of steer new visions for places. That's about the public sector. That's about the private sector. That's about, I mean, we've talked about further education, the skills sector here, academic institutions. All of these players, I think, have got a part to play in thinking about what their shared responsibilities for a place is. It's going to require some more patient approaches than perhaps we've seen in latter years. But I think there's huge potential to think about sort of more bespoke governance arrangements for these places, which draw in all of those actors and develop a really genuine shared sort of value proposition. Because it's that shared value proposition that's going to attract the private investment, the private capital that everywhere's still going to need. Yeah. There's not oodles of public money flying about to sort of re-inject into these places. Certainly not in London.
Julie?
I'm involved with a town investment plan, and MHCLG have identified 100 towns nationwide to look at town investment plans for their centres. It's quite a novel and new arrangement because what it's saying is, look, council, we will give you funding for what you think is appropriate for your town, but you've got to get your stakeholders around the table, and your stakeholders have got to input into that town investment plan, and out of that town investment plan, there may be 3 or 4 projects that you can then bid for funding. So I think it's been, in the arena that I've been working in, I'm on the board, and it's just been so exciting to deal with those people that have vested interest in that town and know of all these particular projects. Maybe one had been lying dormant for a while, but actually let's bring it forward. Let's lay them all out and then really understand what are the key priorities and what is going to get the economy moving in that particular area and revitalise that area. So, you know, it comes back to that stakeholder, listening to the stakeholders, but actually bringing them all together in a very collaborative fashion. But that actually takes leadership, because you've always got to have somebody chairing that group and taking soundings, understanding that group, and really getting under the skin of the people that are on that board. And I really hope it's happening where I'm working at the moment in one particular town. I hope that's happening throughout all of the 100 towns where MHCLG have said that there's going to be funding.
Yeah, superb. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paul Hanegraaf, Patrick Dubeck, Julie Pears. Thank you very much for your insights and thoughts. My closing point was to ask you actually if the retail cup is half what? Question. I'll take it that it's half full, if only because actually at this moment in time, we all are innovating and cohesively, one would hope, together. Thank you very much, everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your conference.